Hey, it's Jeff Hyman, your startup therapist, where we focus on the people part of startups. And I'm here with a fantastic guest, Mike Morrell of Riviera Partners. How are you, Mike?
Doing well.
It's good to see you.
Yeah, same here.
So let me give a quick intro of you because you have just a fascinating insight into this topic of recruiting rock stars, especially technology-oriented rock stars. And then we'll get right into it. And we'll spend about 15, 20 minutes, and I think people are going to learn a lot from this discussion. You co-founded Riviera Partners in the Bay Area about 13 years ago, 2002.
Yes.
You're now
Yes.
one of the largest executive search firms focused on really senior-level technology-oriented individuals. You do a lot of chief technology officer searches, VP of engineering, VP of product. That's your bread and butter?
Yeah, that's our bread and butter, product and engineering.
Great, and it's a good size firm. You got about 80 people in the firm, so I know that's a large recruiting firm.
Right.
Good. So with that perspective, what we'd like to focus on today is for individuals who might be watching this, maybe CEOs or VCs, who perhaps have not recruited a lot of technical senior talent before. Some of the mistakes that you've seen people make, some of the watchwords and some guiding principles that you would use and with your clients, that would be just hugely helpful to us, because especially someone like me, if you're not a tech person, hiring tech people can be a bit tricky, right?
Sure.
So
I think one of the early things that we stress when we engage with clients is to make sure that you have a real understanding for what you're trying to accomplish with the hire. Right. I think a lot of times, the flashiness of brand names, confuses people on what they're really looking for. So, we try to really do a good job of understanding what the true requirements are. So making sure that there's alignment, not just with us and the CEO, but across the organization. I think alignment is super important. And that goes, extends to the VCs as well.
Right.
So a lot of times our meetings are started with the CEO. But it's important that, as you get closer to the end of the process, that there's no surprises coming from the investors.
So if I'm the CEO or the founder of the business and I'm recruiting either my first senior tech person or perhaps it's a replacement, what are some of the things I want to think about to figure out at what stage and what kind of person I should be looking for?
Right. So I think the stage is an interesting, kind of variable. I think we look at stage of companies in a couple different ways. There's the folks that are the 0 to 10, 0 to 12. At that point, direct line of reporting is still doable. I think from that, call it a dozen to 25, 30, you're now required to kind of manage through managers of teams anywhere from 8 to 10 folks. And then as you go from 25 to 75 or 25 to 100,
Yep.
You're looking now at folks that are managing through managers and so 2 levels down.
Managing managers.
So managing directors that manage managers. So you're usually like 2 levels down. So it's important to understand, I think a lot of times, one of the bigger mistakes is to think that you're going to get all of that kind of experience in a single package. And ideally that's what you go for, but you have to realize that companies go through different stages of growth. So you need to look at kind of how do you hire to get somebody that can take you from where you're at today to the next major
Right.
milestone or 2.
So if I do nothing else, I've already learned something big, which is just hiring a VP of engineering from Twitter or Google is not necessarily right for my company if I'm not at a comparable stage to where that person worked, correct?
Correct.
So,
I think having that experience, that stage experience is very important.
am I focused? Should I be focused on someone that has been successful at my stage or the next stage so that they can grow me into that? How do I kind of think about that gradation?
Yeah. So I don't think necessarily you have to find somebody that has been the number one at a similar stage. I think you want somebody that's had that experience and has seen what those growth pains will be at that stage. So
Right.
Finding somebody at a Facebook today that joined 2 years ago, or a Twitter today that's joined 2 years ago, while you're a fledgling startup that is trying to get from 10 to 25.
Yeah.
there's a lot of stuff that has to happen. A head of engineering at that stage may need to get into the code,
right?
May need to kind of do these code reviews, and so somebody that's operating at a much higher level, the chaos that happens in an early stage company is very different than kind of the organizational challenges that you have at scale.
Which is
important to understand.
Which is not to say that person may not be able to do it. It just means that I'm going to take a greater risk that they'll be successful, because I really don't know, right?
Correct.
And
Correct.
they may do great, or they may flame out very quickly.
Yeah, I think you want to look at somebody that's had some exposure to the next kind of plateau or the next bend in the curve. I think that's super important, because I think it's, as you grow, you have different challenges. From, give you an example. So at 10 or 12 people in engineering, probably not much process, if any.
Yeah.
Probably not much automation, if any. Probably not much, kind of recruiting process, if any.
Yeah.
At that point, it's kind of usually. So going from that point to the next stage, you need to implement, automation and kind of testing and deployment, and you need to have a true kind of playbook for recruiting, because you're exhausted. You've exhausted your network at that point. So all these things, you want somebody that's had exposure to that, so that's not all new. There's going to be some things that they learn. I mean, every playbook is going to have kind of addendums, but at the end of the day, you want somebody that's feels comfortable operating with that that type of situation.
And just so I'm clear, Mike, those tiers that you described, you have found it to be most useful to think in terms of number of people, not revenues or some other metric?
Correct.
And people just within that group, that department, or the whole company? So when you said 10 to 12 people, did you mean any?
Within engineering?
Okay.
And those numbers are not, they're not magical, where we came up with those. Yeah. We look at, a single line manager, so a head of engineering in a startup, say, co-founder, probably can have 10 direct reports.
Sure.
At 10 direct reports, it starts to get a little squirrely.
Even 10 is kind of high, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. So you start to kind of get to that point where it becomes a little bit squirrely. So then you bring in your first manager. So now one person's managing 5, one person's managing 6 or 7.
Yeah.
So that next stage is really to kind of put 1 to 2 managers in place. And so those numbers, if you just kind of back into those numbers, if you think that a good manager can manage 5 to 10 people, you bring in a couple managers now. You have a head of technology that can manage 2, 3, 4 managers.
Right.
And so that gets you to 25.
So let's shift gears a little bit to the next thing I get asked a lot, which is hard skills versus soft skills, especially in a chief technology officer, a VP of engineering, et cetera. How do I get my arms around thinking about prioritizing technical skills with my particular platform that we've chosen, et cetera, versus soft skills, culture fit, DNA fit, ability to recruit a team, et cetera?
So I think that the latter part, the culture, the fit, is absolutely the most important thing. I've never hired somebody that's been successful that's not been a good cultural fit. So I think that's kind of table stakes, right? I think you have to also be very self-aware on what you're trying to be as a company. A lot of companies say, well, we want to be known as a great engineering organization, which in some cases, when you're developing very cool, leading edge technology, is a much easier task than when you're an e-commerce company, right? Applying technology that other people are kind of inventing. So I think that the culture is the absolute most important thing.
So I'm clear, pick the individual candidate who's a great culture fit, a great DNA match, even if she or he hasn't worked on our particular platform, versus the person who's a perfect fit from a platform and a tech skills perspective, but might be a little bit off in culture. You go with the first one every time.
Yeah, and I would say, that's assuming that they have similar IQ, right?
Yeah, sure.
Right?
All else being equal.
All else being equal, I think absolutely you go for cultural fit, because that then becomes the engine for growth within that group, within engineering, within product, within the company, for that matter. It really comes down to culture. So I think we always stress that and that's why when we kick off searches, we'd like to meet multiple people in the company so that we can say, we can understand, what is the culture really like? Yeah. Is there alignment in kind of vision and purpose from the CEO down to the first line managers or other functional areas of the business.
Many CTOs and VPs of engineering have a reputation for sometimes having a bit unusual personalities. They're perhaps more introverted, quieter, a bit quirky, however you want to describe it. And that's not a generalization, but it happens more in the tech field. How much leeway should a founder or a CEO have for that kind of individual, those kinds of characteristics? And when does it become a barrier? For example, the CTO won't be able to hire people or recruit people. How do I think about that?
Yeah, so I think there has to be a very good balance between EQ and IQ, right? I think a lot of people put the emphasis on technology roles of hiring super smart individuals, and then realizing that they can't socialize. Yeah. And so I think that goes back to the fit, right? If you are a small company or a medium-sized company that's just really into the technology, sometimes that you can kind of slide by a little bit, but as the organization scales, you need to have kind of mentors and folks that understand the softer side, because everybody has wants and desires and wants to be mentored and wants to develop. And if you don't have that sensitivity, it's going to be very tough to be a leader. So I think you see a little bit more kind of emphasis in my viewpoint on the softer side stuff,
right?
As being almost as important as the technical.
And how do I interview for that? I understand how I can interview for technical skills. How do I interview for EQ, which is emotional quotient, or personality, or culture fit? How do you interview for that?
Well, I think that you have to understand. You have to be somewhat. You have to reflect on what your culture is. Going in day one, and I think spending time in not just an interview scenario, but in a social setting. I always recommend that you get somebody out as you're kind of going through this process, and bring a couple folks from the organization and see how they interact. Are they comfortable kind of in conversation? Are they not comfortable in conversation? I think that those things are something you have to spend time and invest in trying to identify, right? I don't know if there's a magic bullet to say this is how you determine EQ.
Right.
I think EQ is how do I feel when I'm around this person?
Right.
How does this person make others feel when they're around him?
Can I see that they know how to lead? They know how to bring the best out of people. They know how to sell their ideas. They may need to sell their technology vision to our board or our VCs. Do I think they can do those kind of things?
Right. And I think that's the question you're trying to answer. And I think it's really important. It goes back to the first conversation or first question you had around requirements.
Yeah.
Right. If board exposure is important, then you need to probably include your board in the process.
Yeah. Right.
And when you're doing reference checks, you need to kind of make sure that they've had some level of board experience. If that's not a requirement, then you don't have to necessarily vet for it.
So we talked about interviewing and vetting on the soft side. Let's talk about the technical skills, the real meat. Let's say I'm a non-technical founder or CEO, and I'm hiring a CTO or a head of technology, a head of product, whatever it might be. How do I interview and assess for technical skills when I am very easy to pull the wool over my eyes? Should I expect that this candidate will even have a vision for our technology? Do they even know enough to? And how do I reduce my risk on just the pure tech front?
Right. So I think if you're a non-technical CEO, I think it requires a little bit more work to get that piece right. And I think that the Valley's a great place. There's always people that have had the experiences that you're going through that are more than willing to kind of offer up insight, references, advisors. So I think it's really important if you are a non-technical CEO that you spend a little bit of time trying to make sure you build a pretty reasonable quality bench for advisors.
And have those advisors interview the candidate or no?
Correct.
Oh,
correct.
I see.
Right. So you need to know where your deficiencies are. And I think, but it's also about how do you problem solve. Whether you're a great coder or not, I think is only part of the equation. I think the other part is, are you a good problem solver? Can you think through? Do you have kind of a reasonable approach to getting to the right answer by pulling in resources or by doing your own research or by tinkering yourself? Right. I think it all comes down to that. Whether or not you can code, you can still code at a high level, or are you a great architect? I think those things you need to kind of work through with folks that have had more experience with that. So I wouldn't necessarily say that, if you're a non-technical CEO, this person is going to be your right hand.
Right.
So you need to spend enough time making sure that there's a trust. That you trust this individual, that you're on the same kind of wavelength when it comes to thought process.
Right.
Do you think going big all the time is one thing, but being pragmatic and actually shipping product is another. So is there a little bit of the yin and yang? So
there's two components that I heard you say. One is use an advisor, someone that I trust, to interview for technical skills and give me feedback on whether the candidate has got the stuff. And then second, work directly with the CTO to work through some problems and just see, do we kind of think and solve problems the same way? Are we talking over each other? Do we come at it from completely different angles? I don't know. Maybe that's a good thing sometimes to balance each other out. But if we clearly can't work together in a couple hours, that's a problem.
Right. And I would actually, I would flip the order, right? I think it's important, obviously, getting an advisor is not something that happens overnight.
Yeah.
So the minute you start to identify kind of deficiencies in your own skill set, it's super important that you go find somebody to help help you in that area.
Right.
But the working sessions are a great way to, and you get a couple people in the room. So it's not just CEO, VP engineering, CTO, CEO, CTO.
Yeah.
It's, okay, we've got 3 or 4 people on our team. How do they work with this person? Do they feel like when they ask him a question, and they walk out of the office, do they feel smarter than when they walked in?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Even if it was his idea, if he made it feel like it was their idea. I mean, these are all things that...
Leadership 101.
Exactly.
So we got a couple minutes left. Let's do a bit of a speed round with some of the other questions that we get frequently. Are you there?
Yeah.
I lost your video. No, you're back. Okay. Question number 1 that I get quite often. I'm a founder, CEO. We're going through a process, whether it's with a recruiting firm or not, and we've got 2 candidates. I like candidate A for very specific reasons. My board, my investors, my VCs like candidate B. Which one do we pick? Do I put my foot down and say to the investors, folks, I'm running the business, I know what we need more than you do, or do I defer to my board and my investors? So
I would say the latter, right? So this is somebody you're gonna have to work with, 7 days a week, right? So, but I think there's a way to kind of avoid that, that delta between having 2 camps. I think it's important at the beginning of a search to understand what your 5 requirements are.
Yeah.
And how you weight those requirements, right? Because it's very, very unlikely that you have dead even candidates. You may have 2 candidates that are above the bar.
Yeah, they're both going to have strengths and weaknesses.
Right. So if you prioritize that and give them a weighted value at the beginning of the search and get it buy-in there, I think it comes out differently.
Okay. Next question I get. Right now, hiring a CTO or a head of technology, especially in Silicon Valley, is probably one of the hardest searches there is. Where are you looking to find these people most effectively, most efficiently?
So I think you have to look at companies that have gone through similar phases of growth and are dealing with similar or have dealt with similar problems. I think being a bit focused on, I need somebody out of the consumer space or I need somebody out of the enterprise space. I think you need to start with you need to find a great cultural fit.
Right.
You need to find a great leader. You need to find a great problem solver. They'll figure the other things out. So I think that you're always trying to find ways to expand your target ecosystem, right? And so I think,
and to reach that target, let's assume I can't use a search firm, right? I can't afford an executive search firm. Am I cold calling them, or am I using job postings? So I use LinkedIn. What are you finding these days to get at these folks who are just so rare and hard to get at?
Yeah, I think that's all. That we deal with the same challenge ourselves. Yeah. How do we get to folks? I think where we've had a lot of success is spending a little bit of time trying to understand what is the connection between me and this individual, right? Whether it's an investor, whether it's a peer, whether it's a former colleague, you have to find some way to get a warm introduction. You can always go the cold introduction, the cold reach out, but those candidates are getting 1,000 of those a quarter.
Yeah.
and it's just it becomes noise. So
1,000 a quarter.
Easy.
So that's help me with the math. That's a few a day. They're getting in terms of outreaches right. So if you don't, it's just like the advice of going to a VC. A cold call is a waste of time. You have to get a personal introduction. You're saying if I find a candidate I want to talk to, I better find a warm connection to that person.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
That's great advice.
And you can get kind of secondary benefits of that as well. You can if you find somebody that knows them, you can ask, what do you think? Is this the right type of role? So what you're trying to do is take a lot of the uncertainty out of making decisions along the way, but also what are my best, increasing my odds, and what are my best chances of getting to that person.
Last question in the speed round, and then we'll wrap it up. I've made a hire, CTO, a head of engineering, and whether it's 6 months in or 6 years in, it's clearly we've got a problem. The person is no longer the right individual for the role. Maybe they've changed. Maybe the business has changed. The CTO and the VP of engineering, I frequently hear from founders and CEOs, they're very concerned about parting ways with them because they know where all the bodies are buried. They know the architecture of the system. They've hired every engineer, and those engineers might go with them and leave. So it could collapse the whole company. How do I get my arms around that, and how do I develop the courage to make the change that has to be made, obviously, without imploding my company?
Right. So I think it's something that probably doesn't happen overnight. So I think it's important to kind of be aware of things as they progress, develop relationships with others in the organization. It shouldn't be, engineering's over there and business is over here, and I don't know what's happening. I think it's super important that you develop relationships with all of your staff on the technology side. But I think when a decision has to be made, it needs to be made quickly, because an average search takes 3 to 4 months from the start point. Right. It takes another 3 to 4 months for somebody to get up to speed. Right. And so if you delay a decision by 3 or 4 months, you're now looking at an opportunity cost of 1 year before you get somebody functioning again. So I think it's important that the CEO understands how that organization is being built. Right. If you have a VP that leaves and it crumbles, then it was probably designed incorrectly.
Right.
The organization was designed incorrectly.
In which case, it was the CEO's responsibility and the CEO's fault.
Correct. So I think that you want to kind of let the VP of engineering make those decisions, but there needs to be kind of thought put into am I building bench strength, right? And is there kind of a succession plan for this individual, right? So
is that another way of saying trust but monitor? The CEO or founder, even if they are not a technical individual, has the responsibility to ensure that the tech leader is developing an organization and processes and all those kinds of things. You can't just say, Harry, go develop the technology and I'm going to go sell.
Correct.
If you've done that,
you could, but then you run big risks of finding yourself 18 months in not really understanding why decisions were made or how the org was structured.
That's great. Mike, you clearly know this stuff inside and out, so we're very grateful. How can people reach out to you, get in touch, if they want to learn more about the search work that you do at Riviera, et cetera?
So the website is rivierapartners.com, RIVIERA partners.com, and my email address is just michael@rivierapartners.com.
Michael, super. Thank you so much, Mike. This is very helpful.
No worries, Jeff. Thanks for the time.
Yeah, see ya.
Cheers.